Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. It is generally believed that Islam gives sanction to the inhuman institution of slavery, and the general opinion which is expressed by our scholars is that even today prisoners of war can be made into slaves, and especially women can be captured as slave women, as prisoners of war, and then converted into slaves. And of course, sexual relations can also be established with them. So this is a grave misconception, and Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi has tried to dispel it in his tafsir of Surah Nur, in his celebrated exegesis Tadabbur Quran. It's available online by the URL is www.tadabbur-i-quran.org, and you can just Google it and go to the tafsir and read it yourself. It's also partly available in the English language. So perhaps the cause of misconception is that there was a certain period in which Islam gave sanction to slavery. It adopted a gradual process of elimination of slavery because of the fact that slavery was deeply rooted in the Arab society of those times. So Islam actually inherited the institution of slavery, and therefore seeing the fact that it was a deeply rooted institution, it had very strong roots in the society, it adopted a very gradual way, because things which are so deeply grounded in a society, they cannot be dismissed by the single stroke of the pen. We know that slave women, of course, they would be used as prostitutes by their masters, and if they were liberated immediately, they had gone on and opened prostitution houses in the Arab society. And similar was the case with many slave men, because of the fact they were untrained and they could not do any specialized work. So it was, and there was no, of course, they did not have the will to work as well, the way we have in society. So it was all the more reason that when they would be released immediately, they would become an economic burden on the society. So Islam adopted a very gradual way of elimination. This would be very similar to the elimination of interest today from interest-ridden societies. Such is the nature of this institution, that you just cannot simply get rid of it immediately. It has to be a slow process, a gradual process, in which a new system should be eased in gradually, and then slowly the previous one has to be done away with. So this is what Islam actually did also. So when it inherited the institution of slavery, it made a gradual program to eliminate it, and by the end of that gradual program, we know that slaves were given the permission to seek their liberation directly from their masters. But during this interim period, when slavery was still given protection because it was being gradually eliminated, directives which were given, such as the ones that we have, that you can establish sexual relations with your wives and with your slave maidens. So we have verses like illa ala azwajihim aw ma malakat aymanuhum, which would mean that men can establish sexual relations with their wives and with their slave maidens. So this is that interim directive that was given when slavery was still in process of that gradual elimination. And this perhaps became the cause of misconception. People thought that this interim period is, or this directive which belongs to the interim period, perhaps is something which is permanent, whereas of course it was not. And Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi has actually outlined those gradual measures which the Quran and Islam and the Prophet of Islam adopted to slowly change the mindset of people regarding this inhuman institution, and to do away with it as soon as possible. So Ustaz has actually outlined those steps which the Quran took, which the Prophet of Islam took right from the beginning. So the first thing that we come across is in Surah Balad, which is a Makkan surah, this very emotional style of appeal which says, Fakku Rakaba, release the necks. It actually urges people to set free their slaves of their own accord. It inspires them, it motivates them, that people who have been created by the Almighty as free men, who are we to enslave them? Who are we to make them enter into bonded labor? So the first step which religion took was that it made this vast appeal, its emotional appeal, it has a very touching effect, release necks, fakku rakaba, as if these necks have been tied with fetters and yokes. And then the second thing which the Quran, which we know the Prophet of Islam, and of course we come to know about it through various narratives, did was that he asked us to be very polite and treat them very kindly. And in the Quran we know that to treat slaves very kindly has been specifically mentioned. It has been mentioned that you should be kind to your travelers, to your neighbors, and to those whom you possess as your slaves. So this kind attitude actually has been explained by some of the other scholars by telling us that people were actually told that they must have the standard of living raised of these slaves and actually equate them to their own standard. So whatever the masters are wearing or eating, they should give the same standard of living to their slaves, so that it becomes difficult for them to maintain slaves and they are set free. So the second step which was taken was that their standard of living was required to be raised so that it becomes difficult to maintain them. And then the third step which was taken was that the atonement for various sins, for the atonement of various sins, liberating a slave was given as an option. For example, if one breaks an oath, or one unintentionally kills someone, or one is guilty of zihar, which was a form of divorce, then to expiate this crime or this sin and to atone for this sin, it was said amongst other options that liberate a slave, so that an impetus is given to this movement of slave emancipation. And then the fourth step, viewers, which was taken was that slave men and women, they were encouraged to marry each other, so that prostitution is done away with, so that this immoral habit, which of course becomes a part of the society, is done away with, and the standard, the moral standard of slaves is also raised, because when they'll marry with each other, of course, that would mean that they would behave as a family and they would raise a family. And then, viewers, the fifth measure which Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi has actually pointed out is that there was a whole head which was fixed in the public treasury, the Baitul Mal, from which slaves could be bought from their masters and liberated in large numbers. So there was a head in the Baitul Mal that you can just use the money in the Baitul Mal, buy slaves and set them free. So this is how an impetus was further given to this campaign of slave emancipation. And then the sixth thing which Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi has mentioned is that fornication was regarded as a crime. Adultery was regarded as a crime, and people who would indulge in this would be, of course, punished. And because of the fact that a lot of slave women would be made as prostitutes and their masters would make them work for themselves and earn to themselves, when prostitution was actually disallowed and it was prohibited, it actually put an end to this institution as well, thereby discouraging men or masters to actually hire or take slave women for this purpose. And seventhly, and very importantly, in order to change the mindset of people, Islam actually and the Quran encouraged that the name slave man and slave woman, which is actually abd and ama in the Arabic language, is done away with, and in its place a simple Arabic word for boy and girl or man or woman, fata and fatat, was used. And this actually was meant that the mindset regarding the slavery should change, and instead of calling them as abd or ama, which of course means slave, man or slave woman, they were called as man and woman, and the word slave was just eliminated so that we could actually call them by the same name or by the same category as we ourselves belong to. And then the eighth measure which Islam adopted, in fact this was adopted very earlier on through the Quran, that very earlier on when the first battle of took place between Muslims and their adversaries, which was the Battle of Badr, Surah Muhammad was revealed, in which it was said that no longer can you make slaves from prisoners of war. So it said, Imma mannam ba'du wa imma fida'an hatta tada al-harbu awzaraha, that either you set these prisoners of war free out of taking ransom, or set them free without ransom, but you cannot make them slaves. And we should also know that one of the biggest sources of slavery in those times were these battles in which people would be caught and made slaves. So this was immediately put an end to very earlier on in Mecca. And the only slaves which were then left were the ones which was being sold in markets or which were being kept at home. So for them, this gradual process was adopted, which I am just outlining before you. And then Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi has said that the ninth and final measure, which was perhaps the last nail in the coffin, was that each slave and man and woman was given this permission that if he or she could provide guarantee to his master or her master, that it would not become an economic burden on the society and would live as good individuals, as responsible individuals, and they seek liberty for this, then the Quran says, Katibuhum, you must set them free. So in other words, if they could guarantee that they'll become responsible citizens of the society, and they asked for being liberated, then it was incumbent, it was mandatory upon their masters to liberate them, to set them free. And this, of course, was the final measure which was taken, and it was, of course, taken near the end. But unfortunately, in spite of all these measures which Islam adopted to eliminate slavery, it still seems that our scholars think, because of that interim period in which we know that slavery was given protection, because of the fact that it was being gradually eliminated, somehow the interpretation was that slavery still exists, and even today some slaves can be captured as from prisoners of war, converted from prisoners of wars and taken as slaves. So this whole exercise was meant to present before you the opinion of Ustaz Amin Ahsan Islahi, the way he has presented it in his tafsir of Surah Nur. He has actually made a very convincing case that a slow, gradual process of elimination of slavery was adopted, which unfortunately Muslims after the Sahaba passed away, or maybe after the Prophet passed away, did not adhere to, and right after he passed away, we find that slavery returned the way it was in the times when Prophet started his task, his mission, and all of it suddenly just came back, and it existed all these years in those caliphates, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ottomans. All of them had slaves, and thousands of them, and they had concubines, they had mistresses, and it was only in this early last century when this was put an end to. But for all these years, we find Muslims blatantly not understanding and violating this Quranic directive that slavery stands prohibited as far as the Quran is concerned. Hopefully, inshallah, we can read through Ustaz's commentary and find this out ourselves as well, and make us, this gives a lot of assurance to us that Islam, of course, does not encourage slavery at all. It is a misconception, and it's a label that has been put on Islam. It is something which it never ever sanctioned. And if we understand these measures which were taken by the Quran, and the final measure in which it was said that you have to set them free come what may, if they ask for their liberation, if they ask for liberty, this was something which has perhaps eluded us, and we need to revisit, especially our scholars, they need to revisit this issue and perhaps revise their opinion. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين والمسلمات.